So most people moving to the Denver area think Golden and Arvada are basically the same. And that's exactly why a lot of people end up choosing the wrong one. Because on a map, they look interchangeable. But once you're living there, your day-to-day life feels completely different. And if you choose based on the wrong priority, you'll feel it pretty quickly. So how do you actually decide between Golden and Arvada? Because if you've been searching things like moving to Golden, Colorado, or maybe living in Arvada, Colorado, or even best suburbs near Denver, these two show up side by side all the time, but they don't function the same way. And this decision ends up affecting your commute. It could affect your weekends or how often you actually get to the mountains and how easy your life feels once you're here. So let's simplify this right up front. This decision really comes down to one thing. Do you want immediate access to the mountains and a more defined activity environment? Or do you want more flexibility, more space, and ease into your day-to-day life? So once you see it that way, everything else starts to click. And if you're relocating to West Denver and you're narrowing down between Golden, Arvada, or maybe even Lakewood or Littleton, this is one of those decisions that seems simple at first. Then you get here and you realize your daily life feels very different depending on which area you choose. So let's start with where this really shows up. What does a random Saturday actually look like? Because this is where people either love where they live or they start to second guess it. Now, Golden has a very defined feel, walkable downtown, Clear Creek running through it, right up against the foothills. Everything is close together. But here's what catches people off guard. Golden feels like a destination, not just for you, but for everyone else. You've got locals, you even have visitors, and you've got activity connected to the Colorado School of Mines. And you've got people moving through town on their way to hiking trails, on their way to climbing spots, and the I-70 mountain corridor. So weekends feel pretty active, sometimes a little too active. A typical Saturday in Golden might look like grabbing coffee and walking along the creek, heading out early for a hike or a trail run, or maybe even just meeting friends at a brewery. How about spending time downtown where there's always something happening? And here's where people get surprised. They picture themselves doing that every single weekend. But sometimes you just want a quiet Saturday. And Golden doesn't always feel so quiet. Now, for some people, that's exactly what they want. It feels energetic. It feels connected. It feels kind of very Colorado. But for others, it can feel a little bit more active than they want for everyday life. Now, let's compare that to Arvada because Arvada feels more spread out, a little bit more residential and less centered around one main area. And weekends certainly feel a little different. A typical Saturday in Arvada might look like perhaps going to a local park or trail, or meeting friends for brunch nearby. Or how about running errands? Simple as that, quickly and easily. Or maybe driving to a trailhead when you want that outdoor time. Or maybe just enjoying more space at home. And what surprises people about Arvada is this. It doesn't feel boring. It just feels easier. Less planning, less friction, more flexibility in how your day actually unfolds. So here's the real question. Do you want your weekends to start right outside your front door? Or are you completely fine driving a few minutes or maybe more to look for those options and that space? Because that answer alone usually points you in the right direction. All right, if you're deciding between these two, I'm really curious. Which way are you leaning right now, Golden or Arvada? Just drop it in the comments below. I read every single line. And by the way, I'm Nicole with the Mama Bear team at Exit Mosaic Realty. I help people relocating to the Denver area. I help them figure out where they'll actually be happy living. All right, let's layer in the practical side. Because Golden is smaller, around 20,000 people, more contained, more defined. While Arvada is much larger, around 120,000 people, more neighborhoods, more variety. And when it comes to mountain access, Golden certainly has the edge. You're typically 5 to 10 minutes from I-70. It's direct. It's simple. You may decide to go west and you're on your way. Now from Arvada, it's more like 15 to 25 minutes. Still very doable, just not as immediate. So let me ask you this. Are you realistically heading to the mountains during the week? Or is it just mostly on the weekends? Because that answer changes how much that this really matters to you. Now let's talk about something a lot of buyers overlook. How about Boulder access? Because from Golden, you're usually about 25 to 35 minutes. And from Arvada, you're a little bit closer to 20 to 30 minutes. So Arvada has a slight advantage there. And this matters more than people expect because not all your time is spent going west. Sometimes you're heading north. So ask yourself, where are you actually going on a regular basis? All right, let's talk about the commute, because the commute to downtown Denver, both are pretty similar, roughly 20 to 35 minutes, of course, depending on traffic. But if you need access to the Federal Center or West Side employment, Golden usually has a slight edge. And here's what matters more than time: consistency. How predictable that drive feels, just on a random weekday. So again, where do you need to be on a regular basis? All right, let's talk about the airport, because this becomes a bigger deal than people expect, especially if you're traveling for work often. Because from Golden, you're usually looking at about 40 to 55 minutes. And from Arvada, more like 35 to 50. So Arvada has a slight advantage, not dramatic, but noticeable over time, like I said, if you travel often. Now let's talk about home prices. Golden typically comes at a premium, paying for those views, right? Less inventory, more competition. Arvada gives you a little bit more flexibility, more options, more variety at different price points. And that leads to another big factor: inventory. Golden can get tight if you're very specific in your search, while Arvada tends to give you a little bit more consistent choices. So let me ask you this: how specific are you about the home itself? Because that can certainly shift this decision pretty quickly. I had a client relocating from out of state who was set on Golden. They love the idea of being right next to the mountains, but once we mapped out their actual week, not the imagined version, but their real routine, they realized they weren't going to the mountains nearly as often as they thought. What they needed was more flexibility in the home, easier airport access, and less friction day to day. They ended up choosing Arvada. And after they moved in, they told me it just fit their life better. Not because Golden wasn't great, because it is, but because Arvada solved the problem that they actually had. And that's the shift. This isn't really Golden versus Arvada. It's really about, do you want proximity to the mountains and a more active centralized environment? Or do you want flexibility? Do you want space and a day-to-day routine that feels just a little bit easier? Because one is built around access and the other is built around options. And neither one is wrong. They just serve different priorities. So once you figure out which one fits your lifestyle, the next question becomes, what does it actually cost to live there right now? Because pricing between these areas can vary more than people expect. So if you want a clear breakdown on what homes are actually selling for across West Denver, including Golden and Arvada, watch my Denver market update next. That will give you a real world picture before you start your search. Until then, I want you to remember, life is short, live somewhere awesome, and be well. We'll see you next week.